Hello, everyone. Welcome to Firelight's celebration of Juneteenth on this wonderful day, June 19th, 2020. We are here on this day of celebration and reflection. We're also joining the Movement for Black Lives National Call to Action today with this panel. So we welcome you. My name is Loira Limbal. I'm the Senior Vice President of Programs at Firelight Media. And before I do anything else, I would like to just ground us in a land acknowledgement. I am joining you from the Bronx, New York, but more importantly, this place that I'm calling in from is known as the land of the Lenape people. On this day of reflection, as we think about slavery and its legacy in this country, I am reminded of the words of a friend and community member who we recently shared space with, who was part of the Cousin Collective, who gave us a loving note of the idea that when we talk about slavery as this country's original sin, we are perhaps inadvertently erasing or contributing to the continued erasure of the genocide and the violence and the brutality that our Native American siblings faced and continue to face. So I want to ground us in that land acknowledgement and invite all of you who are joining to share with us in the chat where you're calling in from, how you're feeling today, and to name the indigenous communities whose lands you are joining us from. I want to say a quick word about Firelight Media. Firelight Media is actually in its 20th year. We're 20 years old this year. We were founded by Marcia Smith and Stanley Nelson, first as a nonprofit production company to tell compelling stories about the African American experience. About halfway through our existence, we expanded to include a number of different programs to serve artists of color, filmmakers of color working on sometimes their first or second or more documentary films. And we also do quite a bit of work around serving, reaching, and cultivating communities of color as the most important and primary audiences for the films that we make and for nonfiction cinema at large. So that's a bit about Firelight. I'm going to say a word about this series, the Beyond Resilience series. This is our third event of this new series. And this space is meant to very simply be a collective space for folks in the nonfiction cinema field to be able to both tell the truths that we need to be sharing and hearing about each other's experiences in the space, as well as thinking collectively about potential solutions with a real goal of helping us, positioning us to be able to make concrete and structural change, the change that we all know is desperately needed. As we have seen over the last few weeks of the uprising, every sector, every crevice of the United States is undergoing a reckoning, and the documentary field needs to undergo one as well. So this is a collective space for us to do that work and to have the uncomfortable conversations. I also want to say, and so welcome to today's episode. We're really thrilled about our lineup and topic for today, again, celebrating Juneteenth and talking about power in Black communities and writ large. I want to also thank Andrea, who is joining us from the Sign Language Company for ASL interpretation. This is part of Firelight's effort to make these panels more accessible. Also want to note that once the panel is over, we do post the recorded event to YouTube, and those videos will have closed captions. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator. I also just want to say that everyone on this panel today these are like my favorite people on the face of the planet, some of my favorite thinkers. And so it's a real honor and joy to have them with us today. So our moderator is Alvin Starks, who is the director of the equality team at the Open Society Foundations in the US. He oversees grant making related to racial justice and racial narrative. Welcome, Alvin.
Hi, Loida. Happy Freedom Day, everyone. Excited to be a part of this conversation. I really could not think of a better place to be and to be in conversation. Hold on. To actually be in conversation with a group of stellar thinkers, activists, and cultural warriors. Again, my name is Alvin Starks. I'm with the Open Society Foundations. And I must admit, in preparing for today's conversation, I really felt that we are at a new moment. As Loida said, we are experiencing a level of electricity, a level of reckoning, a reimaginement of power, a rethinking how we address anti-Black racism. And all of our institutions must come to the altar to say what we've experienced and also to reconcile and to correct what we want the future to be. And of course, this is all related to power. This moment, which feels earth-shattering, that feels like it's crackling in the air, has created new space. And so now we have an opportunity to figure out, what are we going to do with this space? We've got new space around culture, policy, the economy, politics, in ways that we've never had before. And so today's conversation is really to actually help us think about who we are, what do we want this space to do, and actually how we move forward. Because we are doing this on Juneteenth, obviously that's been very much a part of today's identity, but also a commemoration of something that is oftentimes untold, but has become popular. And this is the Tulsa Race Massacre, also known as Black Wall Street. So I'd like us to begin there. Let's start the story there. We have a clip that we want to show from the boss, and then we will come back. Thank you.
Between the 1870s and the beginning of World War I, Black pioneers settled more than 100 all-Black towns in the West, each with the goal of economic independence. Among the most well-known was a Black district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known by its residents as Greenwood.
If we were to go back in time to 1920 and walk up and down Greenwood Avenue, one thing that would probably strike us is the absolute variety of businesses. The numbers are astonishing. 30 restaurants, 45 groceries and meat markets. There were dry goods stores, milliners, photography studio, dental offices. Greenwood is no longer called Greenwood. It's now known as Black Wall Street.
This whole idea of self-containment really existed there. The dollar would stay in that community sometimes over 3-5 years before it ever went outside of the community.
In 1919, Black soldiers returned from World War I with high expectations for racial progress at home. But in one city after another, white mobs erupted in violence, targeting Black veterans, citizens, and businesses. Hundreds died. On Tulsa's Black Wall Street, African Americans, including armed veterans, watched nervously and prepared for what might come.
Countering this white militancy is very much an African-American spirit of we're going to defend ourselves. If the mob comes, we're not going to run, we've got our guns, and we're going to protect ourselves. And that was especially important and valuable and potent in Greenwood.
On May 30th, 1921, the mob came to Greenwood.
This white woman is in an elevator, and this black teenager allegedly whistles at her or talks to her. He is taken to jail. A mob gathers of whites and blacks, and blacks in Tulsa are armed. They take their Second Amendment rights seriously, and they come with guns. And this is a threat. Someone fires into the crowd, and the riot is born.
Shortly before dawn, there are preparations for an invasion of Greenwood. The police start handing out rifles and shotguns to members of the mob, who they then deputize as special deputies.
This was not about the whistling boy in the elevator. This was about blacks becoming too economically powerful and showing that wealth in a way that anyone would, by creating buildings and constructing churches and having property.
There was a whistle that blew, and then the mass invasion and the destruction of Greenwood began. It goes block by block. Any African-American men who resist are shot. Others who are still there are all rounded up by mob members, by police officers, by these special deputies. Whites will then break into businesses, loot what they can, and then set them on fire. And by that afternoon on June 1st, more than 1,000 homes and businesses belonging to African Americans have been looted and burned to the ground. Greenwood is no more.
When the smoke cleared in the early morning of June 1st, 1921, Black Wall Street lay in ruins.
This is by far the largest single incident of racial violence in all of American history. What can't be denied was the loss, and the loss that these business owners suffered. This was capital that they would never, ever get back, nor would their descendants as well.
So thank you. I'd like to bring up our first panelist. Stanley Nelson, who many of you know, is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, also a recipient of the National Medal of the Humanities, who's also his latest film, Miles Davis, The Birth of Cool, premiered in Sundance in 2019. Stanley, welcome. I want to start off with a set of questions. Your film, Tulsa, actually has re-entered the public discourse in ways that I find amazing, but your work has also really explored history. And it seems that history is ever present. So I'm curious to hear from you about how you use narrative and filmmaking to build power, and specifically what you think the role of the filmmaker is in this contemporary moment.
I think one of the things that I believe and we believe really strongly at Firelight is that people need to tell their own stories, and that's one of the things that we have pushed and tried to enable other filmmakers to do, and I've tried to do, is tell the stories that I can tell deeply. You know, that stories that are part of my culture and part of who I am. And I think that's really important for us all to do. And so that's what we've tried to push and do at Firelight. I want to say, before I go any further, that the clip you saw is from a film called Boss, that you can see the whole thing for free at pbs.org. Also, I'm on Martha's Vineyard in the land of the Wampanoags, who are still here and still fighting. And right outside my window, they're holding a huge celebration of Juneteenth, a combination of African Americans and the Wampanoag tribe, and later they're gonna do something else at Aquinnah, their tribal land. So they're here and are strong.
Stanley, I also want you to kind of open up a little bit more about how you unpack these layers of erased history. It sounds really simple, but I imagine that this is an act of love in order to produce a memory that is oftentimes lost. And so speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways, you know, I don't want to belittle it, but in some ways, it's easier than we might think. You know, people are waiting to tell their story. People have not been given the chance to tell their story. We're working on a larger film now on Tulsa than the little chapter that you saw, and people are just waiting. Nobody's asked them about their story. We did a film on the Freedom Riders, and nobody had asked the Freedom Riders about their story. Nobody had looked, you know, in depth at the Black Panther Party and just sat down and talked to people about their stories. So I think that there's so much that's there if we, you know, put in the time and the effort. The other thing that happens so many times with our history is, you know, on an anniversary, you know, the news will say, okay, you know, 2 weeks before or a week before, oh, they'll say, oh, isn't this the anniversary of that thing that happened in Tulsa? You know, pull the clips and let's, you know, and that's what they do. They haven't gone into depth about what really happened or try to investigate or going into the story. And so that's what we try to do to bring these stories to light.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stanley, it's interesting because when I saw Boss, and in particular that clip, it reminds us deeply that oftentimes when power is acquired, there's also a power struggle, right? Mm-hmm. And there's something inside that storyline that oftentimes isn't really explored about how do you sustain power. So I'm curious, as a filmmaker, how do you sustain your own narrative power?
Well, I mean, one thing I've committed myself to saying, you know, always is that I've been very lucky, you know, and I've been very lucky to be able to make films and to make the films that I've made. You know, our system works by letting, you know, 1 or 2 people through. You know, it wouldn't work if nobody went through, and you know it hasn't worked to let a number of people through. So you know I've been very lucky, one of the lucky ones that's been let through. I think one of the things that we're doing at Firelight is you know they let me in the door, so I'm trying to keep the door open and let some more people get in. You know, I think one of the things that we need as filmmakers in our community is the resources to let more African American and other people of color tell their own story. And we really need that. And one of the things that we need to do that is more people of color as gatekeepers. You know, that's what's really hard, you know. I've been doing a series of meetings over the last week, you know, virtual meetings, pitch meetings and stuff. We haven't talked to a single executive of color. You know, it's every time we have a meeting, it's with white folks pitching, you know, our story. So I think it's really important, not only that we do what we're doing at Firelight, and you know more filmmakers, you know, get out there with their work. But that's going to only happen if the resources are directed at filmmakers of color.
So Stanley, before I let you go, because I work in the industry of philanthropy, there's a particular conversation that the current political moment has flooded the resources to all Black organizations, right? So the coffers are overflowing, you know, and which I think is, of course, a mythology. But I'm curious, how would you suggest that we inoculate that myth, right? And it's also permeated in a very deep racialized thinking that Black groups, people of color groups should actually have a financial cap. But how do we keep moving forward knowing that there's a perception, a false perception, that there's floods of resources inside the nonprofit industries?
You know, I mean, I think we're talking about systemic change, you know, not a one-time grant to you know a couple of organizations. That's what we need, and I think that's what's important, so that, you know, the stories that are told are different stories. You know, I think, you know, look, you know, Alvin, if you were responsible for funding stories, or I was responsible for you know, funding stories, the stories I would fund would be very different from what's funded now. You know, when we're pitching a larger project on Tulsa, you know, the executives, all of them really had never heard of it before at all. You know, had never heard of it. And I think, you know, one of the things I've said in these meetings, it's kind of this myth that most Black people know something about, have heard of it, you know, and it's really important. So I think it's not only creating, you know, more and better product and more and better filmmakers, but it's also reallocating resources that go to African American filmmakers. You know, I think that I've said it before. I think one of the best things that a filmmaker who's not of color can do is to think twice or three times before they do a project about African Americans. They need to think about, maybe it should be done by an African American, and maybe the best thing they can do is to pass it on and mentor an African American, just so they understand. You know, when we hear about another film by a white person about Black people, it's not like Black people sit around the room and say, "Oh, goody, oh, isn't that great?" You know, we sit around and say, "Not, oh God, not again, not again." And one of the worst things that happens is then what happens is, you know, the white powers that be end up giving those films awards. You know, like, "Oh, that's a great film." You know, so a film, and I can say this because I don't think I'm hurting anybody on this, you know, on that's with us right now. You know, the film, the Hollywood film Green Book, I don't know one Black person in the world that likes that film. Everybody hates it. And that, you know, but what happened? They got patted themselves on the back and gave it the best picture of the year. So I think that, you know, again, you know, we talk about white privilege, and that's one of the things that white privilege is, and that's how it works in our industry. That, you know, a white filmmaker can walk in and say, you know, "Hey, Bob, hey, Mary, you know, how you doing? I want to do this film on such and such a thing that I know nothing about."
Stanley, thank you. We're going to come back to you. You actually do a great job of making a segue to our next guest. I want to thank you, Stanley, for your work here. You do an excellent job of introducing us to our next guest. We're going to come back to you at the end of this. I want to bring on Solana Rice. Solana Rice is co-founder and co-director, executive director, I should say, of Liberation Within a Generation. Solana is a dedicated advocate aiming to shape the most vibrant, inclusive, and sustainable economy this country has yet to see. Solana's work is actually about reimagining economic power and inclusion, specifically in Black communities. So Solana, I want to say thank you for joining us and happy Freedom Day. I have tons of questions for you, and I want to kind of segue where Stanley left us off. This question of resources has always been a challenge, not always, but a challenge for Black communities to acquire historically. So I want to start off with you explaining to us what the work of Liberation Within a Generation is. So can you start with that?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to Firelight, and this is a fantastic conversation to have right now. Liberation in a Generation is a movement support organization. We are dedicated to transforming our economy and making sure that people of color belong in our economy: Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander. And we do that in order to build the power of people of color. So we work with organizing groups and telling a new story of our economy. So you can imagine that I too have a lot of things going on in my head right now after Stanley's conversation.
So Solana, I'm excited that you're here because I've been doing some reading on what's called racial capitalism. And I would love for you to, I would love to hear what you believe that is, and actually how you apply that, if at all, within your own work.
I'm so glad that you raised that. I've been steeping myself in racial capitalism work in the last couple of months because The Forge just came out with a new edition focused on racial capitalism. So folks can check that out. But I see racial capitalism as a system that makes money off of racism, where racism is profitable, where we have these narratives of stolen land, stolen labor, stolen wealth from indigenous people, Black people, immigrants. These are really the pillars of racial capitalism. We call it an oppression economy, right? Where racism is profitable. And it really is based off of the idea that, and the actions that theft, exclusion, exploitation, these are all racist tactics that have really been profitable. And I really love the work that we have just seen, because it reminds us that capital has never been returned. And I think that's a really important point, and that in turn diminishes our power. So racial capitalism cannot be divorced from our democracy and how we got here as well.
You're reminding me of something else. Nicole Hannah-Jones said something recently that really stuck with me. She said that people of color, and in particular Black people, can never work themselves past or through the racial wealth gap. And I was really taken by that, because oftentimes we believe that wealth, if I work more hours, then somehow I close the opportunity or make new opportunities for the generation beneath me. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, what are either the policy interventions, the ideas that you're percolating that you think need to really be employed in order to build that level of economic power and inclusion?
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. So the racial wealth gap as it stands right now is Black wealth is 10 times less than white wealth right now. A college-educated Black person has less wealth than a white high school dropout. Again, this wealth is critical to participating in our democracy and making sure that we can provide for future generations. I think that the solutions are twofold. One is that we have to build a liberation economy, what we call a liberation economy. It's based on the ideas that people of color will have safety and security. People of color will be valued and compensated. People of color will belong, essentially. But it has to be paired with what we call dismantling the oppression economy. And this is in large part why just building income will not solve this wealth gap. Because imagine I go to work and I work and I work and I have money. Where do I put it? Do I put it in the bank that then takes exorbitant fees? Do I put it in the home that's not going to grow and accumulate as an asset like my white neighbor? Where do I put that income? So we have to build structures that dismantle oppression, and that includes criminalizing people of color. That includes curbing corporate power. That includes ending the disenfranchisement of people of color. If we can't change the rules by which this economy runs, we are always going to get the short end of the stick. So I always have to temper what the solutions are with there's optimism and there's things that we need, and there are things that we absolutely need the courage to say have to end.
Mm-hmm. So Solana, you seem to be a part of a new generation, or at least a new renaissance, and really rethinking the patterns of inequality. And so when you think about the work that you're doing, how do you see your work folding into this larger movement for Black lives? How do you really wrestle with the various ideas that movement has really brought to us? And in particular, if you could leave this group with an overarching thought about the economy, what would it be?
Yeah. So our relationship, Liberation in a Generation, is built to support movement. We are not the movement. We are not the people that are building power amongst people of color. We want to bring our expertise and our experience to organizers that are interested in also undergirding their current activities with a racial economic lens. The fact that we are at the brunt end of climate change, of housing insecurity, of corporate concentration, these are all linked together and undergirded by economic oppression of Black people. And so our focus is to make sure that as Movement for Black Lives, Dream Defenders, BYP 100, all kinds of organizations that we want to work with are going into their fights, not only with the demands on the signs, but clear policy proposals and with an economic analysis about what the costs are and what the gains are. And really being very targeted about who is making those decisions and following the money, as some of my colleagues have said, following the money to where the power really is. My big recommendation and suggestion is that we do have to narrate a different story of this economy. The economy is not the stock market. It is not austerity. The economy is essential workers. Right now, Black people are much more likely to be essential workers than white folks. People who are being evicted by the end of this month, we'll have, it's slated to end rent relief, right? So what does that mean for people? These are the people that are the economy, not shareholders of corporations. And so I think the work that Firelight is taking on, and so many economists and people of color, to change the narrative about what is possible and what is needed in this economy is absolutely critical.
Solana, before we move on, I have to ask you another question. I'd be remiss if I didn't. COVID. COVID-19 had a specific effect on communities of color. And I would love to hear your thoughts about what you think the recovery should be. What is the responsibility to really make sure that COVID-19 does not create a permanent underclass for people?
Yeah, I think this is a huge opportunity right now. We are at this confluence where we are calling for defunding the police and doing community investment. We are making huge changes to respond to COVID. I like to think of this as a gateway to a set of guarantees. And we've already seen some of this happening, and it's very exciting. So, there are organizers that are working on decarcerating, getting people out of jail right now because it's a public health crisis. But guess what? It also makes economic sense to release people who just can't pay bail, right? So we're on our way there. We have started handing out checks to people. That is also, that's fantastic. We need to keep doing that and keep doing it monthly. We are well on our way to a basic income. When we think about the big investments that we need to make sure that housing is affordable, we've started to relieve the rent, right? We haven't canceled the rent, but we're starting to relieve the rent. And there's folks like at People's Action talking about the homes guarantee, right? We are on our way and we have some ideas. So I think we really use this moment as we're making small down payments in the response to COVID, but we should be on our way to a suite of guarantees: income, jobs, healthcare, housing, debt-free college, wealth. So I think that's what I'm hopeful about right now.
I have a question from the audience. I just want to ask that before we move forward. Would supporting Black-owned businesses in our community support your last statement?
So Yes, Black-owned businesses are important, but I will say this, and I'll give you a stat from Tulsa, actually. So right now, the average wealth of the average value of a Black business in Tulsa right now is $34,000, compared to $825,000 of a white business owner. I'm a proponent of Black entrepreneurship. It is not the only way to jumpstart our economy. And we have to be very careful, because Black business owners are under a double tax, right? They're Black, for one thing, so they have less capital to draw from. And we are trying to employ other Black people, and we're trying to pay people more than a minimum wage, right? So I do agree that entrepreneurship can be a gateway, but so many people aren't entrepreneurs, and that is actually a really risky way to build capital as well. So it's not the highest thing on my list of structural issues, because we have a public duty to supporting Black people, not just entrepreneurs.
Solana, thank you. We're going to come back to you in a bit, but that's a perfect segue to our next and final panelist, Latasha Brown, who will look very familiar to many of you. Latasha is the co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, a power-building Southern-based civic engagement organization that played an instrumental role in the 2017 Alabama U.S. Senate race. Ms. Brown is also a well-known activist, nonprofit strategist, and works in the space of leadership, wealth creation, and civil rights. She is also a fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Latasha, are you there?
I am here. How are you?
Hey, Latasha. So good to see you. So in continuing this conversation about power, right? I want to hear more about your analysis of what does it take to build power in Black communities.
You know, I think the first piece is, I think we have to be comfortable with examining what is power and what we perceive as power, and we create our own definition on that. And I'm raising that because oftentimes the very thing that we seek to get from under its oppression is the very thing, on the other hand, we say we want, right? That we'll have more power if we're more ingrained in this system. We'll have more power if we get in the same kind of positions and using the same tactics that people who have literally worked against us. So I say that to say that I think it's really important for us to really recognize, even for me, around power, the power to really be able to express the fullness of who you are, you know, free of any fear from racism and sexism, all of those the forms of oppression, to move forward. And I think part of centering that, having that discussion and centering what that looks like in terms of our emotional, our physical, our political, and our economic power. I say that because oftentimes I'm in conversations, and it was similar kind of feed off from the last conversation. There's this idea that if you go to school, when I grew up, go to school and save you some money. Stay out of jail, go to school and save some money, right? And there's studies that have been done. There's a study that was done by Ford Foundation a couple of years ago that actually said that if you gave every single African-American person $1 million and a graduate degree, it would still take over 200 years for us to catch up and close the wealth gap. I'm raising that because even on some level, when we're talking about, well, we just got to get more entrepreneurs, and we've got to get just in more position. There has to be structural change, or we're forever locked in a system that disempowers us. And so I think when we're talking about power, one, it is literally getting to a place where we're our healthiest whole self, that we can actually demonstrate our choices, our right of choices, our humanity, and literally stand in our power. I mean, stand in that space that says that this is who I am and this is what I do. And so part of doing that, I do think that it is a fundamental narrative shift within ourselves. But I also think we have to acknowledge there's institutional structures that we've got to advocate and we've got to change. And this is the moment to use our radical reimagining. What is our radical reimagination of what America could be, of what our lives could be? The goal isn't to just replicate, moving forward and replicating those tactics of those that oppress us, but it's literally around what is the best system, what is going to create the kind of space so that I can show up in my whole self and others like me can show up in our whole self.
So, Latasha, I know you think a lot about these issues, and I'm just curious if you could invite us into, you know, your deep brilliance. Can you help us see one particular power game changer that you think would actually create a systemic power shift in how we think about how the game is being played, but also create new rules for the game?
So I am actually going to, I don't know if this quite fits in that, Alvin, but I think an example is what we're seeing on the streets right now when people are saying defund the police. When there are abolitionists that are saying, it's interesting because people are saying, no, let's not defund the police because that means we won't have protection. Because unfortunately, what we have done is we've allowed ourselves not to reimagine what that could be. We've only seen a particular way of being. And I can even say as an activist and somebody that thinks that I'm consider myself a visionary, I remember being in London during the Olympics. And I don't know how I did not know this, but I'm in London at the Olympics, and there's this guy who is drunk right next to me, and they call the police come and handle him, and the patients, their whole goal was to get him home, not to put him in jail, and their patients, and I sat there and it was amazing. I looked at them, and what I did know is I didn't know up until that point that they didn't have guns, that there was special units that they called for guns. That belief was almost unconscionable for me. Like, how could you be the police officer and you don't have guns? Why? Because in America, right, that whole threat of violence is so much a part of the institutional. So I raise that. The reason why I shared that story is because I think we also have to push ourselves to radically reimagine what it is that we want. Our engagement with the police has always been violent in nature. Matter of fact, the very expansion of the police came out of the evolution of what was slave patrols, right? And so I'd say this often, well, let's just make some reformation within the police is like saying, let's create a just and equitable slave plantation. Can't do it, but fundamentally, institutionally, but within the institution is racist. And so, and the shaping of it. So my point is, I think one of the pieces that we're looking at what could fundamentally, if there was a fundamental, if there really was a system that was about rehabilitation, right, and about redemption, if there really was a force that existed not to be a law enforcement, but a system of those who were dedicated to carrying out the peace and protection and safety, what could that look like? If there was an economic system that literally said there is some baseline of what people need, fundamental needs, so that we can actually heighten the creativity of humanity, what would that look like? And so for me, I think those are some of the things that I think is about. I don't know if I have all the answers or even if my ideas will work, but I am pushing myself to think beyond what I have inherited, not by my choice.
So, Latasha, I followed you around the Georgia election. And that also seemed like a moment in time that we needed to study and really think about, was power being diminished in different spaces? And so my question to you is, what do we need to do to ensure that we don't recreate the lessons that you've learned from Georgia?
I'm sorry, it froze, so I missed what you said.
My question to you is, I know that you were in Georgia, and I'm really curious what we can learn from your experience to make sure that we don't recreate some of the chaos or the oppression that happened for folks in Georgia around elections.
So, and you know, what we are struggling with right now, what we're struggling with in this state is, we think of voting, in the conversation of voting, particularly in the African-American community, is around participation, right? That's really not where the center of the conversation should be. The conversation is around power. right? And ultimately, we should be thinking of voting as power, right? One form of power, but power. And so we're not measuring our success of how many people vote. We have to measure our success by what kind of impact that we leverage that vote to actually advance the conditions of our community. And so when we shift the frame and start shifting the center, and like what we, and the center, instead of being a candidate, we're two candidate center. We waiting on the next Obama is candidate to ride up on a horse and save us all. One, that whole belief in the first place was a fallacy. Secondly, there's no evidence that this whole idea of that there's that one person within a system is going to fundamentally make the system okay. No, but what it does, but what we do need is we do need the kind of representation that's really going to provide some relief for our people. And so that is harm reduction. I raise that because as we're going around doing the work that we're doing in Georgia and 11 other states, when we talk to Black folks, we don't talk to Black folks about convincing them to believe in a system that they know inherently discriminates against them. That we would just be lying if we told them anything different, right? What we tell them, though, is the shift of power is not about that system. It's really about you demonstrating your agency. And every time you stand in your power and your agency to make a decision about your community, that is a form of using your power. And so that's a different kind of focus point. I say all of this to say that as we're looking at these elections, we cannot underestimate the voter suppression, like what we saw in Georgia, right? That's not by accident. Right, we're even working on, Black Voters Matter now is working on, with some of our partners to do election monitoring program. So we can actually monitor. The United States sends hundreds of people all over the world to monitor their elections, to make sure that they're democratic and fair. Yet here in this country, consistently, we see this huge discrepancy around how Black people are treated, how their applications are kicked out, how they have problems on election day, the whole spectrum of voter suppression. And so I think, one, we've got to make voter suppression a key issue for us. Two, we literally got to start voting, particularly in a way that's informed by issues, not in terms of personality. And three, every single Black person in America needs a political home. I don't care what it is, but you need a political home, a base, a safe space in a Black experience to literally explore what are our ideologies, so that we're not glued to CNN or MSNBC or Fox or any of those. And then we're starting to create and craft our own thinking based on a premise of a media that has less than 17% of people in color in any of their newsrooms.
Latasha, stay right there. What I want to do is I want to invite the other panelists back so we can actually share the mic a little bit. So I see Solana. I'm hoping Stanley can possibly join us as well. Both of you are brilliant. So I'll just keep us moving. I'm really curious, Stanley, there you are. I'm really curious to ask all three of you, because you talked about narrative, you talked about the economy, you talked about politics. And I'm really interested in hearing what inspires the three of you. What is it that you use to find joy in this particular moment? I'll just stop there. I'm just really curious to hear about how you energize your own creativity, your own expressions of joy.
I can start. I mean, I'm energized because we have a story to tell, and we have a people, and we have a cause, we have a purpose. So I'm energized by that. I'm energized at the moment. I'm energized when I turn on the TV and I see young people out there, you know, politicized for the first time. I see my three kids who weren't, you know, that political out there every day marching. So, you know, and I think, you know, what I tell them, because they're really angry. And I think a lot of young people are really angry. And I say, you know, that's okay, but we got to do this with love. You know, we can't become the people that we're fighting against. You know, we have to do it with love, so that when we win, and we have a loving community.
I'll say that what keeps me energized and focused is, I think back to I asked my grandfather what was one thing that he wanted to know more about. I was doing history for my family. And I thought he was going to say, well, I wish I had have known more about my father, or I wish I had have known more about my brother. And he said, I wanted to know why life had to be so hard. And I wake up every day thinking, we've got, to Stanley's point, we've got to tell the story of why life has been hard, but why it doesn't have to be going forward. And today on Juneteenth, you know, I woke up thinking, I'm just so joyful to have found freedom within. I think it's a very blessed place to be, where you may not be finding freedom outside of your doorstep, but you're forced to find freedom within in order to survive and maintain. And that's what's keeping me going. All of my ancestors and the people, and this call is also giving me like hella joy, as they say here in Oakland.
Love it. Love it.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. It is that spirit that continues, that in the midst of our folks, like who were enslaved, that were treated as they were nothing but chattel. I'm a daughter of a woman who literally was bought and sold 45 minutes from the place that I grew up, but yet here I stand because I come from a people that resist, that even when they were in chains, they were still resisting. Their spirits resisted when their physical, they couldn't get unbundled from physically. They were always our people. If we just remember, I promise you, I believe this, if we just remember who we are and that spirit inside us, all of these systems got to come tumbling down, all of them. But the biggest piece for us is to remember that spirit of freedom. And that's what moves me, that in the end of the day, I get tired, and yes, I get tired, and of the racism just packed on and on. But what I do know is that I am from a great people who have always resisted.
Wow. Thank you. I feel like I just got a brilliant gift from being a part of this conversation. Everyone's saying this is amazing, this is beautiful, this is goosebumps. And I always want to ask the people that we share space with, what do you need from us? What can we do to actually help, you know, you go a little higher? What can we do to advance your work? Because we really do feel deeply connected to what you've offered on so many different levels. And I know there are people that you don't even know that you touch, that you inspire, that you transform, you know, the very ground that we walk on. So I'm just curious, like, what can we do to help you out a little bit? What support do you need?
So I'll just raise my organizations. There are two organizations I want to lift up that I co-founded. One is Black Voters Matter Fund. We're working in 11 states right now on the ground, supporting and building out Black grassroots groups. People can text us, if you text We Matter to 797979. You can stay up updates, and we're on all the social media at Black Voters MTR. I'm Miss Latasha Brown, MS Latasha Brown. You can follow us on social media, and we put all the stuff that we're doing. The second is another a really, really amazing project that I'm proud of, which is called the Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium. In 12 states, we are creating a fund created, conceptualized, and designed by Black women and girls from the Deep South. And we are creating an initiative. It's a $100 million initiative for the first 10 years that we're going to fund and support those things that Black girls and Black women think are important. So follow us, Southern Black Girls and Women's Consortium.
Thank you.
I'll follow along and say that if you are interested in organizing your community and having a racial economic analysis to drive your power building work, check us out at liberationinageneration.org. And also, we just put up a summer reading list of articles on the Forge. If you want to know more about racial capitalism, go to forgeorganizing.org.
Okay, so you can follow us at Firelight Media, right? Is that right? Follow us at Firelight. And I mean, so where we are, I mean, we're just going for it. In this moment, we're going for it, and we're speaking the truth even more than we ever did. I think one of the things at Firelight, we're all working at 200%. Loida and Marsha, me, everybody, and we're going to continue to do that. We want to really change the way the documentary film industry works, from who gets funding, the stories that get told, the festivals, the gatekeepers. I think all of those things need to change. And I think if these organizations that are pledging this amount of money and that amount of money, or tweeting out their Black Lives Matter celebration, if they really want change, then it's up to them to step up. I mean, we don't have the power. They do, and what we're trying to do is take the power. We have the power to organize, and that's what we're doing. So, we're really stepping up what we do and how we do it, and becoming more efficient with what we do, and also more ambitious. I think now's the time. Now's the time for all of us to speak up. There's so much that Black people kind of shake their head and talk about, when we're among each other. Now's the time to just like throw it out there. You want to celebrate Juneteenth. You want to talk about Black Lives Matter. Well, here it is. Here's how we really feel. So that's what we're doing.
So Stanley, Solana, Latasha, on behalf of everyone who had the privilege of being a part of this conversation, our digital community that listened in, we want to thank you for this inspiring conversation. It was truly a blessing to be in this presence. And so I'd like to introduce Loida Limbaugh to actually close us out, and for more information on what's next. Loida, take it away.
Oh my goodness, Latasha, you had me in tears, like shaking, worried I would not be able to gather myself in time to come back. But the deepest, most cleansing, wonderful kind of tears. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for the reminder. We do come from a mighty, mighty people, and we will win. We will win. I believe that we will win. I want to say thank you to Alvin. I want to say thank you, Solana. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Latasha. As everyone knows, this period is chaotic, right? And it's super intense. And I literally emailed these folks one night at like 11 p.m. And when I woke up the next morning, they had all responded with yeses, enthusiastic yeses. And so I just want to acknowledge and extend my gratitude for your generosity, because I know that you're all working at 300% right now and on multiple front lines for our folks in our community. So thank you, thank you, thank you for your time and your generosity and your insights. So powerful. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I want to thank Andrea, our ASL interpreter. I want to thank the team behind the scenes making this work. Nicole, Jimena, Felicia, thank you so much for keeping us on track and making this all look super smooth. Just a couple of quick things I want to share. Next week, next Friday, we will be back at the same time, same place. The conversation next week, June 26th, will be about audience care as we think about impact and engagement for our films in this moment of, both physical distancing continues to be the norm. We have uprisings swelling across the country, and thinking about how do we build our plans with care and attentiveness towards our audiences. The very brilliant Sonia Childress will be leading that conversation and will be taking us through a number of case studies of different impact campaigns that have launched in this moment, and raising all the critical questions that we need to be grappling with. As you all may have heard, if you have not, Sonia recently published an essay that I think is a must read. And so I think hopefully somebody will drop it in the chat. If you haven't read it, please do so. It is directly talking about the reckoning that needs to happen in our field. So again, a must read. And my last little tidbit is that Firelight's documentary lab is closing our open call for submissions on June 29th. So if you know any first or second time filmmakers of color, please encourage them to apply. It's an 18-month fellowship. Again, this is for Black, Indigenous, and POC folks across communities that are underrepresented. 18-month fellowship, mentorship, you receive a grant and a lot of support from a pretty fantastic community of POC filmmakers. So those are all my announcements. And with that, again, thank you everyone for spending a little bit of your Juneteenth with us. Happy Juneteenth. I hope you get to rest and celebrate and restore and stay in it with us. We in it for the long haul.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.